There is a trap that has destroyed four of the most powerful empires in human history. Not through war, not through invasion, through mathematics. In 1557, Spain controlled more silver than any nation in history mines in Potosi. Bolivia produced 8 million pesos annually, flooding Europe with precious metal. The Spanish Empire stretched from the Philippines to Peru, from the Netherlands to Naples. The sun never set on Spanish territory. And yet, on November 29th, 1557, King Philip II declared bankruptcy. Spain could not pay its debts. This was not a one-time event. Spain declared bankruptcy again in 1560, and 1575, and 1596, 1607, 1627, 1647, 1656, and 1662. 9 bankruptcies in 109 years. By 1598, interest payments on Spanish debt consumed 40% of the entire state income. The richest empire on earth was trapped in a debt spiral it could not escape. Thanks for watching. I stated in 23 and the next. 232 years later, in 1789, France, the most magnificent monarchy in Europe, faced the same trap. King Louis XVI had inherited a debt of 4 billion livres from his predecessors. His government could not pay it. His finance ministers resigned in succession. And on July 14th, 1789, when he called the Estates General to approve new taxes, the people stormed the Bastille instead. The debt crisis became the French Revolution. 4 years later, the king was executed. The debt trap had ended not just a dynasty, but an entire political system. 201 years after that, in 1990, Japan, the economic miracle that analysts predicted would overtake the United States, watched its asset bubble collapse. The Nikkei stock index fell from 39,000 to 15,000. Land values crashed. Banks held trillions in non-performing loans. The government responded with massive stimulus spending, driving national debt above 250% of GDP. 36 years later, in 2026, Japan has still not recovered. An entire generation has lived through what economists call the lost decades, plural, because there is no end in sight. I 7 prown to times 7 piece, 2,000 round of. And now, in January 2026, the United States, holder of the world's reserve currency, the most powerful military in history, the largest economy on earth, has reached a debt level of $38.5 trillion. This number was not supposed to be reached until 2030. It arrived 4 years early. The debt is growing by approximately $1 trillion every 90 days. And the annual interest cost, just the interest, not paying down principal, now approaches $1 trillion per year. More than the defense budget, more than Medicare, more than any other category of federal spending. 4 empires, 4 centuries, 4 debt traps, in the exact same mathematical sequence. Spain thought it was immune because it controlled the world's silver. France thought it was immune because it was the grand monarchy. Japan thought it was immune because it was the economic miracle. America thinks it is immune because the dollar is the global reserve currency. History suggests otherwise. The debt trap is not about borrowing too much. It is about borrowing more than you can mathematically repay, then using new debt to pay off old debt until the compound interest spiral becomes impossible to escape. Once this sequence begins, it has never been reversed. Not in Spain, not in France, not in Japan, and every indicator suggests it is now closing on America. This is not 4 separate stories. This is one mechanism, the sovereign debt trap, repeating across 469 years with mathematical precision. The names change, the currencies change, but the sequence remains identical. And in every case, the governments insisted until the very end that this time is different. It never was. The Spanish Empire, serial bankruptcy, 1557 to 1666. In 1556, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, abdicated his throne to his son Philip II. Charles had ruled the largest empire since Rome, stretching across 4 continents. But he left his son something else: massive debts accumulated from decades of European wars. Philip II inherited an empire and a financial crisis simultaneously. The Spanish economy of the 16th century appeared limitless. The silver mines of Potosi in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico produced wealth beyond imagination. Ships laden with silver crossed the Atlantic in treasure fleets. Spain controlled not just precious metals but territories spanning the globe, the Netherlands, much of Italy, the Philippines, vast regions of the Americas. To European observers, Spain was invincible, but Philip II faced a problem his silver could not solve. The Spanish tax system was fundamentally broken. The nobility, who controlled most of the land and wealth, were exempt from taxation. The clergy were exempt. The burden fell entirely on the productive classes, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and they could not generate revenue fast enough to fund Philip's military ambitions. Philip was engaged in constant warfare against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, against England and its privateers, against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, against France for control of Italy. Each war required soldiers, weapons, ships, and supplies, and each war cost more than Spain's regular revenues could sustain. So Philip borrowed. He turned to the banking houses of Genoa, who specialized in short-term loans called acientos. These were high-interest instruments, often exceeding 10% annually, that required repayment within 12 to 18 months. The Genoese bankers were willing to lend because the profits were extraordinary, even accounting for risk. Well, they were something in 25 that, the discommodate. But Philip was not using these loans for productive investments. He was using them to pay soldiers and buy weapons for wars that generated no economic return. The debt accumulated faster than the silver arrived, and the silver itself created a new problem: inflation. As Spanish silver flooded Europe, prices rose dramatically, a phenomenon historians call the price revolution. Spain's cost of goods increased, making its debt burden even heavier in real terms. And our did happen by the skies, just common and wise. By 1557, just 1 year into his reign, Philip could not meet his debt obligations. On November 29th, 1557, he declared bankruptcy, technically called a decree of suspension. This meant Philip was unilaterally halting interest payments to creditors and forcing them to accept a restructuring of the debt into lower interest, long-term bonds called juros. The Genoese bankers were outraged. Credit markets across Europe froze. The Spanish government temporarily lost access to new loans. But Philip had no choice. The mathematics were impossible. The interest costs exceeded his revenues. The remarkable thing was what happened next. Philip borrowed again. Within a few years, new bankers, still Genoese, because the profits were too attractive to resist, were willing to lend to Spain despite the bankruptcy. They calculated that even with the risk of default, the returns on Spanish debt exceeded any alternative investment available in 16th century Europe. And so the cycle repeated. Philip borrowed, fought wars, accumulated debt, declared bankruptcy, restructured, and borrowed again. In 1560, Spain declared bankruptcy a second time. In 1575, a third time. Philip's son, Philip III, declared bankruptcy in 1596 and again in 1607. Philip IV declared bankruptcy in 1627, 1647, and 1656. And Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, declared bankruptcy in 1662, 9 bankruptcies. 109 years. The same debt trap, repeated across 4 generations of Spanish monarchs. Do not. To fret, Gras reference. By 1598, near the end of Philip II's reign, the interest payments on Spanish debt consumed 40% of all state revenues. Think about that number. Nearly half of everything the government collected in taxes went purely to paying interest, not building roads, not funding exploration, not investing in the economy, just servicing debt. The silver from the Americas, which had seemed like infinite wealth, was flowing directly to Genoese and German bankers. Spain was a conduit, not a beneficiary. The empire that controlled the world's silver was perpetually broke. The debt trap did not destroy Spain overnight. It was a slow strangulation that lasted over a century. Spanish power gradually eroded. The Netherlands gained independence in 1648. The military declined. The economy stagnated. And by the early 18th century, Spain had fallen from dominant superpower to secondary European power still present, but no longer dominant. The turning point was not military defeat. It was the moment in 1557 when Philip discovered that infinite silver and an empire spanning the globe could not solve the compound interest problem created by perpetual borrowing. Once the debt exceeded the capacity to service it, the trap closed, and no amount of New World wealth could reopen it. So art of the 7I, with mine is 17. I was 7I, and doesn't it? The French Monarchy, debt to revolution, 1715 to 1789. On September 1st, 1715, King Louis XIV of France died after a reign of 72 years, the longest of any major European monarch. He left behind the Palace of Versailles, the most magnificent royal residence ever constructed, a symbol of absolute power and absolute extravagance that cost the equivalent of $300 billion in today's currency. He also left behind a debt of approximately 2 billion livres. Thanks for watching. If you haven't all of your nows is completed, and some plea to the stand of the start. The simply descriptment of the morning. Louis XV inherited both the palace and the debt, and over his 59-year reign, he added to both. More wars, more luxury, more borrowing. By the time he died in 1774, the debt had doubled to approximately 4 billion livres. His grandson, Louis XVI, ascended the throne in 1774 at age 19. He was well-intentioned but indecisive, married to Marie Antoinette, and inheriting a financial catastrophe. The French government's annual revenues could not cover its expenses. The gap was being filled by borrowing, and the borrowed money was being used not for investment, but for consumption, maintaining the royal household, funding the lavish court at Versailles, and fighting wars. From 1756 to 1763, France had fought the 7 Years' War against Britain and Prussia. France lost. It lost Canada. It lost India. It lost its colonial empire. And it spent 1.3 billion livres doing so. The war was a total loss economically, militarily, and politically. In Steen de Dunate, if you could dup that of the fining, well signed it is a less the side, the back to different, and the new more to this dafte greetinger. And signed it is a less the merrically saying, and we concede his place the different. Then, seeking revenge against Britain, France supported the American Revolution from 1778 to 1783. This was successful. America won independence, but it cost France another fortune. By 1788, the royal debt had reached approximately 5 billion livres, and interest payments were consuming nearly half of all government revenues. Louis XVI appointed a series of finance ministers, Turgot, Necker, Calonne, Brienne, each attempting reforms. Each proposed the same solution: tax the nobility and clergy, who owned most of the wealth but were legally exempt from most taxes. The nobility refused. The clergy refused. And the king lacked the will to force them. Here is what made the French debt trap different from Spain's. It was not just a financial crisis. It was a legitimacy crisis. The French people, particularly the urban poor and the rising middle class, could see clearly what was happening. The monarchy and aristocracy were living in unimaginable luxury at Versailles, while the nation drowned in debt created by their spending. Marie Antoinette's legendary wardrobe expenses, the king's hunting parties, the nobles' pensions. All of this was funded by taxing the peasants and bourgeoisie who had no representation. When catastrophic harvests failed in 1788, causing bread shortages and starvation, the patience of the population evaporated. The question became stark. Why should we starve while the court at Versailles lives in luxury, financed by debt we must repay? In May 1789, desperate for approval to raise taxes, Louis XVI called the Estates General, the first meeting of this representative assembly since 1614. He needed their consent to tax the nobility and clergy. But calling the Estates General opened Pandora's box. Once representatives of the people gathered, they realized they had collective power, and they used it. The cancer pastured from the waste. With that stats of the Naufsum is be a video too. On June 17th, 1789, the Third Estate, representing commoners, declared itself the National Assembly, claiming sovereignty over the nation. On July 14th, 1789, Parisian crowds stormed the Bastille prison, a symbol of royal tyranny. The French Revolution had begun. The National Assembly's early actions revealed the centrality of debt to the revolution. One of their first major decisions was to confiscate all property of the Catholic Church, approximately 3 billion livres worth of land, buildings, and assets. They used this to back a new paper currency called assignats. The idea was to pay off the debt with church wealth. But the assignats rapidly inflated. The government printed more and more to finance the revolution's expenses. By the mid-1792s, assignats were effectively worthless. France had gone from debt crisis to currency crisis to political chaos. Louis XVI was arrested in 1791, tried for treason in 1792, and executed by guillotine on January 21st, 1793. Marie Antoinette followed in October. The Reign of Terror consumed thousands more, and France descended into a decade of violence, instability, and eventual dictatorship under Napoleon. The debt trap had not just bankrupted France, it had destroyed the entire political system that created the debt. The monarchy that had ruled France for 8 centuries ended not because of military defeat, but because it bankrupted itself, maintaining Versailles and fighting wars it could not afford. The turning point was not a single moment. It was the slow realization among the French population that their monarchy had spent the nation into ruin for personal luxury, and then asked them to pay for it through taxes, while nobles remained exempt. When the king called the Estates General to approve those taxes, he admitted his government was bankrupt, and once that admission was made, his legitimacy evaporated. The debt trap destroyed France faster than it destroyed Spain 74 years from Louis XIV's death to the execution of Louis XVI, compared to Spain's century-long decline. But the mechanism was identical. Borrow to fund consumption, accumulate debt faster than revenues grow, reach the point where interest costs exceed capacity to pay, and discover there is no way out. The Japanese economy, the lost decades, 1990 to 2026. In the late 1980 seconds, Japan was the economic miracle of the modern world. Its GDP was growing faster than any other developed nation. Japanese corporations Sony, Toyota, Mitsubishi were conquering global markets. The Nikkei stock index surged from 10,000 in 1985 to 39,000 in December 1989. Real estate values skyrocketed to absurd levels at peak. The land beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically worth more than all the real estate in California. Western analysts predicted Japan would overtake the United States as the world's largest economy by 2000. Books were published with titles like Japan as Number One. American business schools studied Japanese management techniques. The future belonged to Japan. Then, on December 29th, 1989, the Nikkei reached its peak of 38,916 and began falling. By October 1990, it had dropped below 20,000. The bubble was bursting. Japanese banks had lent trillions of yen backed by real estate collateral. As property values fell, the collateral became worthless. Borrowers defaulted. Banks were suddenly holding massive portfolios of non-performing loans. The entire financial system was technically insolvent. Businesses and households, which had borrowed heavily during the boom to purchase assets at inflated prices, saw their balance sheets destroyed overnight. A company that bought land for 100 million yen now owned land worth 30 million yen, but still owed 100 million yen to the bank. Household wealth evaporated. Consumer confidence collapsed. And I comment is be stages on a T-night. The Japanese government responded with the standard Keynesian playbook, fiscal stimulus. They cut interest rates to near zero. They launched massive public works projects, bridges, highways, dams, infrastructure. They injected capital into failing banks to prevent collapse. The Bank of Japan began quantitative easing, buying government bonds to inject liquidity into the economy. And none of it worked. Or more precisely, it prevented catastrophic collapse, but did not restore growth. What followed became known as the lost decade, the 1,990 seconds, a period of stagnation unprecedented in modern developed economies. But the decade did not end. By 2000, Japan was still stagnant. By 2010, still stagnant. By 2020, still stagnant. The lost decade became lost decades, plural. Here is what happened. Japan had fallen into a different kind of debt trap than Spain or France. Not default, not revolution, but zombie survival. Japanese banks, propped up by government support, kept lending to failing companies rather than forcing them into bankruptcy. These zombie companies, firms that were not profitable but not officially dead, remained in business, consuming credit that could have gone to productive new enterprises. They employed workers, so unemployment remained low, but they generated no growth, no innovation, no productivity gains. Meanwhile, Japan's demographics turned against it. The population began aging rapidly. More retirees meant higher social security and healthcare costs. Fewer workers meant lower productivity and tax revenues. The government borrowed massively to cover these costs. By 2020, Japanese national debt exceeded 250% of GDP, the highest of any major developed nation. Yet Japan did not collapse. Interest rates remained near zero, making the debt serviceable. Japanese citizens held most of the debt, reducing risk of capital flight. The yen remained relatively stable. Socially, Japan remained orderly, peaceful, and functional. But economically, Japan became frozen. GDP per capita adjusted for inflation barely grew from 1990 to 2026, 36 years of stagnation. Young Japanese entering the workforce in 1990 are now in their 50s, and they have lived their entire adult lives in an economy that does not grow. An entire generation lost prosperity. The debt trap in Japan's case was not dramatic bankruptcy or revolutionary upheaval. It was the slow realization that temporary economic problems had become permanent conditions. Each year, the government promised recovery was near. Each year, recovery failed to arrive. And eventually, stagnation became the accepted norm. Investment remained depressed because businesses had no confidence in future growth. Consumption remained depressed because households hoarded cash for uncertain futures. And government stimulus could not break this psychological trap. You cannot force people to spend or invest if they believe the economy will not improve. Policy mistakes accelerated the trap. In 1993, Japan implemented Basel capital requirements for banks, forcing them to maintain higher reserves. This was standard international practice, but the timing was catastrophic. Banks responded by cutting lending precisely when the economy needed credit. The decision turned a recession into prolonged stagnation. By 2026, Japan has been trapped for 36 years. That is longer than the average human career. It means Japanese workers who graduated university in 1990 are now nearing retirement, and they spent their entire careers in an economy that never recovered. The Japanese debt trap teaches a different lesson than Spain or France. You can avoid collapse. You can maintain social stability. You can prevent revolution. But the cost is accepting generational poverty, not absolute poverty, but the loss of the prosperity your parents expected you to have. Stability without growth is still tragedy. The American Empire, the accelerating trap, 2008 to 2026. The United States debt trap did not begin in 2020. It began decades earlier. But 2020 was the year the trap accelerated beyond control. In 2000, U.S. national debt was approximately $5.7 trillion. By 2008, it had grown to $10 trillion. The financial crisis of 2008 to 2009, triggered by the collapse of the housing market and the near failure of the banking system, forced the federal government to take emergency action, bank bailouts, stimulus packages, and a revolutionary monetary policy called quantitative easing. Between 2008 and 2014, the Federal Reserve created approximately $4 trillion through QE1, QE2, and QE3. This was not borrowing. It was monetary creation, the Fed purchasing treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities by creating money electronically. The money supply expanded massively without corresponding increases in goods and services. The immediate effect was to stabilize financial markets. Stock prices recovered, real estate stabilized. The wealthy, those who owned assets, benefited enormously from asset price inflation. But the average worker, whose income did not rise proportionally, fell further behind. By 2019, the national debt had reached $22 trillion. It had more than doubled since the financial crisis. But interest rates remained historically low, near 2%, making the debt serviceable. Politicians and economists assured the public this was sustainable. Modern monetary theory argued that countries borrowing in their own currency face no real constraint. Then came COVID-19. In March 2020, the U.S. economy shut down. Unemployment surged. Businesses closed. The federal government responded with the largest peacetime spending in American history. The CARES Act, Paycheck Protection Program, enhanced unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, Federal Reserve emergency lending programs. Trillions of dollars deployed in months. The national debt jumped from $23 trillion in early 2020 to $27 trillion by the end of the year. $4 trillion added in 12 months. It was necessary to prevent economic collapse. But it was also the moment the debt trap shifted from concerning to irreversible. By 2023, the debt had reached $33 trillion. By November 2024, it crossed $36 trillion, and by January 2026, it has reached $38.5 trillion. This number is significant for a specific reason. It was not supposed to exist yet. Budget projections from 2022 predicted the debt would reach $38 to $39 trillion around 2030. It arrived 4 years early. The trap is closing faster than the models predicted. More concerning than the total is the cost of servicing the debt. In 2020, the U.S. paid approximately $345 billion in interest. By 2026, that figure has nearly tripled to approach $1 trillion per year, and it is accelerating. If interest rates remain at current levels and debt continues growing at current pace, interest costs will exceed $1.5 trillion annually by 2030. We have detountlined and degreesen and a degreesend and a degreesen, the Fleinhundred and a degreesen 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 and a degreesen. Think about what that means. $1 trillion per year just for interest. That is more than the entire defense budget, which funds the most powerful military in history. It is more than Medicare. It is approaching the cost of Social Security. And unlike those programs, interest payments provide zero benefit to citizens. The money flows out to bondholders, domestic and foreign, and provides no goods, no services, no infrastructure, nothing. The current U.S. debt to GDP ratio stands at approximately 122%. Economist Ray Dalio, who studied every major debt crisis of the past 5 centuries, identified 150% as the mathematical point of no return. At that threshold, interest costs consume so much revenue that governments cannot fund normal operations without borrowing more, creating a self-reinforcing spiral. At current trajectory, the United States will cross that threshold between 2028 and 2030. And unlike Spain, France, or Japan, America faces an additional risk: the loss of reserve currency status. The dollar currently comprises 58% of global central bank reserves. In 2000, it was 71%. The share is declining steadily as China, Russia, and other nations develop alternatives. BRICS countries are conducting bilateral trade in local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. Now, it is bring us to balance process. Knighting makes one process as grading readed, and a knowing to do another. One process to do and one process, and one process. Reserve currency status is what gives America the exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow in its own currency without fear of default. As long as the world needs dollars for trade and reserves, demand for U.S. debt remains high. But that privilege is eroding, and once it's gone, America will face the same constraints as every other debtor nation in history. The American debt trap is forming faster than any previous example. Spain took a century. France took 74 years. Japan has been trapped for 36 years. America went from manageable debt in 2000 to potentially irreversible trap in 26 years, and the acceleration is increasing. Current political proposals make it worse, not better. The One Big Beautiful Bill being discussed in early 2026 would add another $3.4 trillion in spending over 10 years. Neither major political party is seriously proposing spending cuts or tax increases sufficient to stabilize the debt. The political incentive structure makes the trap impossible to escape through normal democratic processes. The American debt trap is unique in one way. It combines elements of all three previous traps. Like Spain, America may face serial soft defaults through inflation paying debts in devalued currency. Like France, America faces growing social fracture driven by inequality amplified by debt-driven monetary policy. Like Japan, America may accept lost decades of stagnation rather than face the pain of restructuring. And unlike any previous example, America's trap comes with the risk of losing reserve currency status, which would transform the slow-motion crisis into rapid collapse. The trap is closing. The mathematics are locked in. And history shows that no nation has ever escaped this sequence once it begins. 4 empires, 4 centuries, 4 debt traps, but one universal mechanism. The sovereign debt trap is not about politics or culture. It is about mathematics, specifically the mathematics of compound interest applied to government borrowing. Once certain thresholds are crossed, the trap becomes impossible to escape, regardless of how wise or powerful the government believes itself to be. The mechanism operates in 5 predictable stages. Every historical debt trap has followed this sequence, and America is currently progressing through it. Stage 1. The borrowing illusion. Every debt trap begins with a justification for borrowing that seems reasonable at the time. Spain borrowed to finance wars of religion and empire. The logic was clear. Defeat the Protestants, control Europe, and the tribute from conquered territories plus silver from the Americas will cover the costs. France borrowed to build Versailles and fight wars of prestige. The logic was equally clear. Demonstrate French grandeur, intimidate rivals, and economic growth will eventually catch up with the debt. Japan borrowed to stimulate its economy after the bubble burst. Standard Keynesian logic. Government spending replaces private spending during recessions until confidence returns. America borrowed to fight the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic. Emergency logic. Prevent collapse now, worry about debt later. It's the first where comedy friends comment into the flost, and one of the Gansbacks. In each case, the initial borrowing appeared justified. Spain's wars were existential. France's monarchy had ruled successfully for centuries. Japan's stimulus followed textbook economics. America's emergency spending prevented depression. The illusion is believing the borrowing is temporary, that growth will resume and debt ratios will decline naturally. That one more war, one more stimulus package, one more emergency measure will solve the problem and allow normal conditions to return. But compound interest does not care about intentions. It cares only about the relationship between debt growth and revenue growth. And once debt begins growing faster than revenues, the mathematics become inexorable. Stage 2. The compound interest trap. Compound interest is the most powerful force in finance. Einstein allegedly called it the 8th wonder of the world. It can create enormous wealth for investors, but it can also create impossible burdens for borrowers. Here is the mathematical reality. If debt grows exponentially while revenues grow linearly, the gap between them eventually becomes unbridgeable. Spain's interest costs reached 40% of state revenues by 1598. Think about that. For every 100 pesos the Spanish government collected in taxes, 40 pesos went immediately to creditors just to cover interest. That left 60 pesos for everything else: military, administration, infrastructure, everything. And those 60 pesos had to cover not just current expenses, but also the principal on maturing debts, which meant borrowing more, which increased future interest costs even further. This is the compound interest trap. Once interest costs consume a large share of revenue, governments lose the ability to invest in productive activities that might increase future revenues. Instead, they borrow more just to maintain current operations, and each new borrowing increases the interest burden for the next period. The modern American version is approaching the same threshold. Interest costs are nearly $1 trillion annually on approximately $38.5 trillion in debt. That is an average interest rate of about 2.6%. But this rate is artificially low due to bonds issued during the zero interest rate period of 2010 to 2021. As those bonds mature and must be refinanced at current rates of 4 to 5%, the interest costs will explode. At 5% average interest on $40 trillion of debt, which is where America is heading by 2028, annual interest costs would be $2 trillion. That is equivalent to all of Social Security or half of all discretionary federal spending. At that point, America reaches the same place Spain reached in 1598, a plurality of revenues consumed by interest, leaving insufficient funds for normal government operations. Ray Dalio's research identified 150% debt to GDP as the critical threshold. At this ratio, interest costs relative to GDP become so large that even modest interest rates consume unsustainable shares of tax revenue. Above this threshold, countries historically have either defaulted, inflated their currency, or restructured their political systems. America is at 122% debt to GDP and accelerating toward 150%. The trap is closing. Stage 3. The credibility crisis. When markets begin questioning a government's ability to repay its debts, interest rates rise, which makes the debt burden even heavier, which further undermines credibility. This creates a vicious cycle. Spain experienced this as serial bankruptcies. Each bankruptcy temporarily reduced the debt burden through forced restructuring. But each bankruptcy also increased the interest rates creditors demanded for new loans, because they now knew Spain would default again. The Genoese bankers continued lending because even after accounting for default risk, Spanish debt offered higher returns than alternatives, but they charged accordingly. Thanks for watching. And we're gonna reason to our so. The great include and clap to the prove, and we're gonna reason ston. The so for use now the prove, and we're gonna bout one, and subscribe to This Is I. Then down not cluve the 25 the down, and we're gonna live the 25 This Is I've. France experienced this as a legitimacy crisis. When Louis XVI called the Estates General in 1789 to approve new taxes, he was admitting the monarchy could not pay its debts through existing revenues. That admission destroyed the mystique of royal authority. If the king was bankrupt, why should anyone obey him? The debt crisis became a political crisis, became a revolution. Japan experienced this differently. Because Japan's debt is primarily held domestically and denominated in yen, there has been no credibility crisis with foreign investors. But there has been a domestic credibility crisis. The Japanese people stopped believing in future growth. And without belief in growth, they stopped spending and investing, which prevented growth, which reinforced their pessimism. It is a psychological trap as much as a financial one. America is entering the early stages of credibility crisis. Debt ceiling confrontations have become routine, with the federal government repeatedly coming within days of default. Credit rating agencies have downgraded U.S. debt from AAA status. And most significantly, the dollar's share of global reserves is declining steadily from 71% to 58%. This is slow-motion capital flight, not panic, but strategic repositioning by central banks that see long-term risks in dollar exposure. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching this fresh. Stage 4. The policy trap. 3 impossible choices. Once the compound interest trap and credibility crisis are established, governments face 3 options, and all 3 are politically or economically devastating. Option A. Austerity. Cut government spending to match revenues. Live within your means. Pay down debt gradually through sustained surpluses. This is economically sound, but politically impossible in democracies. Cutting spending means reducing benefits to current voters. It means higher unemployment as government contractors lose work. It means visible pain now in exchange for abstract benefits later. No democracy has ever sustained austerity long enough to escape a major debt trap. Spain could not do it because the nobility refused to accept higher taxes or reduced privileges. France could not do it because the aristocracy was exempt from taxation. Japan could not do it because the population rejected any reduction in social benefits. America cannot do it because neither political party is willing to cut programs their voters depend on. Option B, default. Openly refuse to pay debts. Declare bankruptcy. Wipe the slate clean. Spain did this 9 times. Each time, it provided temporary relief by reducing the debt burden through forced restructuring. But each time, it also damaged Spain's credibility, raised future borrowing costs, and ultimately accelerated the empire's decline. By the end of the 17th century, Spain was a second-tier power, despite still controlling vast territories. France's version of default was revolution. The monarchy was overthrown, its debts were partially repudiated through asset seizures, confiscating church property, and eventually the assignats issued to replace specie became worthless through hyperinflation. The default worked in the sense that it eliminated the old debts, but the cost was a decade of chaos and tens of thousands of deaths. America cannot default in the traditional sense because the debt is denominated in dollars, which the Federal Reserve can create. But default could take other forms, refusing to honor debt obligations to Social Security recipients or to military contractors or to bondholders. Each would be politically catastrophic and would end dollar reserve currency status instantly. Option C, inflate. Print money to pay debts in devalued currency. Soft default through inflation rather than open repudiation. This is the path Japan chose. 0 interest rates. Quantitative easing, accepting sustained low inflation. The government can service its debt because the Bank of Japan creates money to buy government bonds. The debt never defaults technically, but the currency slowly loses purchasing power. This is also the path America is currently on. Sustained inflation of 3 to 5% combined with QE programs allows the government to pay nominal debt obligations while reducing the real value of those obligations. It is a slow-motion confiscation of wealth from savers and creditors to debtors, the government. The problem is that if inflation accelerates beyond control, above 7 or 8% sustained, it triggers capital flight, undermines the currency's reserve status, and eventually leads to hyperinflation. Japan has avoided this because the yen is not a reserve currency and Japan's debt is held domestically. America is more vulnerable because the dollar's reserve status depends on global confidence, which inflation erodes. Stage 5, the 4 historical endgames. Once the policy trap closes, 4 outcomes become possible. History provides one example of each. Endgame 1, serial restructuring, the Spanish model. Default multiple times, restructure debt repeatedly, accept permanent decline in exchange for avoiding collapse. Spain declared bankruptcy 9 times over 109 years. Each bankruptcy was a renegotiation with creditors' forced conversion of high-interest short-term debt into lower-interest long-term bonds. Each provided temporary relief. But each also locked Spain into a pattern it could not escape. By 1700, Spain had gone from the dominant European power to a secondary state, not destroyed, but permanently diminished. Which is righted minus stated, which is calming the prize and the basin. This outcome is stable but accepts decline. Spain survived as a nation, but it lost its empire, its military dominance, and its economic vitality. The debt trap turned superpower into has-been. Endgame 2. Revolutionary reset, the French model. Debt crisis combines with inequality crisis and legitimacy crisis to produce revolution. Complete systemic change, not just change in government, but change in the structure of government. Thanks for watching. Have to parent experindide and dining sparendide. France went from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy to republic to dictatorship within a decade. The debt was nominally addressed through confiscation of church property and issuance of assignats. But the real solution was destruction of the old system and creation of a new one. The Ancien regime died with Louis XVI on the guillotine. What emerged was fundamentally different. This outcome is the most violent, but also the most complete. It wipes the slate clean through systemic collapse. But the cost is measured in chaos, death, and lost decades of stability. Endgame 3. Zombie stagnation. The Japanese model. Avoid collapse through unlimited monetary stimulus. Accept zero growth as the new normal. Maintain stability without prosperity. Japan has been trapped for 36 years and continues indefinitely. The debt is 250% of GDP and growing. But interest rates remain near zero. The currency is stable, unemployment is low, and society functions normally. The only thing missing is growth. An entire generation has lived their adult lives in an economy that does not expand. This outcome is psychologically devastating but socially stable. No revolution, no collapse. Just endless stagnation, which is tragedy of a different kind. Endgame 4. Reserve currency loss. The potential American model. No historical precedent exists because no previous debtor nation held global reserve currency status. If America loses dollar dominance through debt crisis, the endgame could combine elements of all three previous outcomes. Serial soft defaults through inflation, Spanish model, social upheaval from inequality, French model, and lost decades of stagnation, Japanese model. Or it could be worse. The sudden loss of reserve status would mean foreign holders of U.S. debt. Approximately 30% of the total would attempt to exit simultaneously. This would crash treasury markets, spike interest rates, and potentially trigger the kind of rapid collapse Mexico experienced in 1982 or Russia in 1998. This is the nightmare scenario, and it becomes more probable the longer the debt trap continues. In January 2026, the United States stands at stage 3 of the 5-stage sovereign debt trap, approaching stage 4. This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition. By comparing current American indicators to the same stages in Spain, France, and Japan, we can see precisely where the United States sits in the historical sequence and how much time may remain before the breaking point. Stage 1. The borrowing illusion. Complete. America has fully embraced the illusion that drove all previous debt traps, the belief that borrowing is temporary and growth will solve the problem. The logic sounds reasonable. The 2008 financial crisis required emergency spending to prevent depression. The 2020 pandemic required emergency spending to prevent economic collapse. These were legitimate emergencies. But the emergency measures never ended. Deficit spending became permanent, even as the emergencies passed. From 2008 to 2026, 18 years, the United States has run sustained deficits every single year. The national debt has grown from $10 trillion to $38.5 trillion, nearly quadrupling in less than 2 decades. This is not emergency borrowing. This is structural borrowing, the government spending more than it collects as a permanent condition. Both political parties share responsibility. Republicans cut taxes without cutting spending. Democrats increase spending without raising taxes. And both parties vote for massive bills that increase the deficit. The One Big Beautiful Bill, being considered in early 2026, would add $3.4 trillion over 10 years, the opposite direction from debt reduction. The illusion persists. We can print dollars. Inflation will erode the debt. Economic growth will increase revenues. We'll fix it after the next election. These are the same illusions that drove Spain to borrow against silver that never materialized. France to borrow, assuming taxation of the nobility would eventually happen, and Japan to borrow, believing 6 months of stimulus would restore growth. The borrowing illusion is complete. Stage 1 is finished. Stage 2, the compound interest trap, entered. America has crossed into stage 2, the point where interest costs begin consuming unsustainable shares of revenue. In 2020, the United States paid approximately $345 billion in interest on the national debt. By 2026, that figure has nearly tripled to approach $1 trillion annually. This happened in just 6 years. The increase is due to 2 factors: growth in total debt and increase in interest rates. The debt grew from approximately $23 trillion in 2020 to $38.5 trillion in 2026, a gain of $15.5 trillion, or 67%. Simultaneously, interest rates rose from near zero during the pandemic to 4 to 5% by 2025 as the Federal Reserve fought inflation. This combination is catastrophic. Not only is the debt larger, but each dollar of debt costs more to service, and the problem compounds. As old bonds mature, they must be refinanced at the new higher rates. A bond issued in 2020 at 1% interest that matures in 2026 must be replaced with a new bond at 5% interest. The interest cost on that specific debt just quintupled. Currently, the average interest rate on all U.S. debt is approximately 2.6% because many bonds still outstanding were issued during the low-rate era. But this average is rising every month as old bonds mature and new bonds are issued at current rates. Within 3 to 4 years, the average rate will reach 4%. At that point, interest costs on $40 trillion of debt would be $1.6 trillion annually. To put that in perspective, the entire defense budget is approximately $800 billion. Medicare is approximately $700 billion. Medicaid is approximately $600 billion. Interest costs would exceed any of these and soon exceed combinations of them. Spain reached 40% of revenues consumed by interest in 1598. The United States currently sits at approximately 15%, but the trajectory is clear. At current growth rates, America will reach 25 to 30% by 2030. The compound interest trap is closed. Stage 2 is active. Stage 3, the credibility crisis, early stages. Markets are beginning to question America's long-term fiscal sustainability. Not panic yet, but concern. The most visible indicator is the declining share of dollar reserves held by foreign central banks. In 2000, the dollar comprised 71% of global reserves. Today, it is 58%. This 13 percentage point decline represents approximately $3 trillion that central banks have shifted from dollars into other currencies, euros, yuan, yen, and gold. This is not random. Central banks are sophisticated institutions that plan decades ahead. They are quietly diversifying away from dollars because they see the same debt trap that destroyed previous empires. They are not selling dollars in panic. They are gradually repositioning to reduce exposure to inevitable decline. China and Russia are leading this shift. They conduct bilateral trade in local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. When China buys oil from Russia, it pays in yuan or accepts rubles. When Russia sells natural gas to China, the transaction occurs without touching dollars. This is de-dollarization, the slow erosion of dollar dominance through substitution. Saudi Arabia, America's longtime ally and the linchpin of the petrodollar system, has begun accepting yuan for oil sales from China. This is extraordinary. The petrodollar arrangement, established in the 1970 seconds, required all oil to be priced and sold in dollars globally. This created permanent structural demand for dollars regardless of other economic factors. If that arrangement dissolves, a major pillar supporting the dollar collapses. BRICS nations Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now expanding to include others, are developing alternative payment systems to SWIFT, the Western-controlled financial messaging system. They are creating institutions like the New Development Bank to rival the IMF and World Bank, and they are discussing creation of a BRICS currency, potentially backed by gold or commodities. None of this has happened yet at scale, but the infrastructure is being built, and the motivation is clear. Reduce dependence on a currency issued by a nation with 122% debt to GDP that is growing rapidly and showing no signs of fiscal discipline. Domestically, debt ceiling crises have become routine. Every few years, Congress approaches the statutory debt limit, and political gridlock brings the federal government within days of defaulting on obligations. These crises always resolve at the last minute, but each one sends a signal to global markets. American political institutions may be too dysfunctional to address the debt trap before it becomes catastrophic. Credit rating agencies have already downgraded U.S. debt from AAA to AA+. This was psychologically significant, even if the practical impact was minimal. The United States is no longer considered the absolute safest credit in the world. The credibility crisis is in early stages. No panic, no collapse, but erosion. Stage 3 is forming. Stage 4. The policy trap, forming. The United States is approaching stage 4, the moment when all three policy options become politically or economically impossible. Austerity, politically impossible. Neither Republicans nor Democrats are proposing budgets that balance. The one big, beautiful bill would add trillions in new spending. Entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, are on autopilot and politically untouchable. Defense spending is considered sacrosanct. Interest payments are mandatory. What remains is approximately 30% of the budget, and cutting that entirely would not balance the budget. Default. Economically catastrophic. If the U.S. openly defaulted on Treasury bonds, it would end dollar reserve status instantly. Foreign holders of U.S. debt, approximately 30% of total, would dump Treasuries. Interest rates would spike. The financial system would collapse. This option only becomes viable if all other options have failed. Inflate. Currently underway but approaching limits. The Fed has already conducted 3 rounds of QE. Inflation ran at 7 to 8% in 2021 to 2022 before moderating. Further sustained inflation risks, triggering the kind of capital flight that destroyed the peso and ruble. The Fed is trapped between 2 impossible goals. Keep inflation low enough to maintain dollar credibility, but high enough to erode debt in real terms. Where the one of protectus creed, I work stiffern one of a later. Where the work stiffens of sout. The policy trap is forming. The window for painless solutions has closed. The window for painful solutions is closing. What remains is choosing which disaster is least catastrophic. Stage 5, the endgame, approaching. Stage 5 has not arrived, but it is visible on the horizon. The most likely American endgame combines elements of all 3 historical precedents. Spanish-style serial soft defaults, sustained inflation of 4 to 6% for 10 to 15 years. Each year, the real value of debt decreases while nominal obligations are met. This is technically not default, but it has the same effect. Creditors are repaid in currency worth less than when they lent it. Spain declared 9 formal bankruptcies. America may engineer 9 informal ones through inflation. French-style social fracture. The combination of debt crisis and extreme inequality creates political instability. America's wealth gap is approaching Gilded Age levels. The top 1% controls 32% of wealth. The bottom 50% controls less than 2%. When inflation erodes the purchasing power of the working class, while asset owners benefit from inflated asset prices, the social contract fractures. France's revolution began as a debt crisis but became a social explosion. America's political polarization and social division suggest similar dynamics forming. We one of the 73 is Rusen any 23. We haven't stuv any 23. Japanese style lost decades. Rather than face the pain of restructuring, America accepts stagnation. GDP growth averages 1 to 2% annually. Real wages stagnate. Living standards plateau or decline for the majority. But catastrophic collapse is avoided through unlimited monetary stimulus. Japan has been trapped for 36 years. America may face the same. The uniquely American risk is the fourth element no previous debtor nation faced: reserve currency loss. If the dollar falls below 50% of global reserves, breaking the network effect, the entire structure supporting American debt sustainability collapses. Foreign demand for treasuries evaporates. Interest rates spike. The federal government loses the ability to borrow at manageable rates, and the slow-motion debt trap becomes rapid crisis. This could happen gradually over 10 years or suddenly in 10 months if triggered by geopolitical shock, financial crisis, or loss of confidence. The key indicators. 4 metrics determine how close America is to Stage 5. Indicator 1. Interest costs as share of revenue. Asterisk, current, 15%. Danger zone, 25%. Crisis, 40%, Spain's peak. Indicator 2. Debt to GDP ratio. Asterisk, current, 122%. Asterisk, danger zone, 150%. Ray Dalio's point of no return. Crisis, 250% plus, Japan's level, but they have internal debt. Indicator 3. Dollar reserve currency share. Asterisk, current, 58%. Asterisk, danger zone, 50%, network effect, begins reversing. Asterisk, crisis, 40% irreversible, de-dollarization. Indicator 4. Inflation rate. Asterisk, current, 3 to 4%. Asterisk, danger zone, 7 to 8% sustained. Asterisk, crisis, 10% plus hyperinflation threshold. The timeline. If current trends continue without major external shocks, 2027 to 2028, debt crosses 150% of GDP. Interest costs exceed $1.5 trillion annually. This is Ray Dalio's mathematical point of no return. 2028 to 2030. Dollar reserve share potentially falls below 50% if de-dollarization accelerates. Network effect reverses. Everyone abandons dollars because everyone is abandoning dollars. 2030 to 2033. Interest costs approach 25-30% of federal revenue, matching Spain's trap level. At this point, the federal government loses ability to fund normal operations without continued borrowing. 2033 to 2035, Stage 5 endgame arrives. Some combination of inflation, acceleration, soft defaults, social crisis, or currency restructuring becomes unavoidable. However, this timeline assumes gradual progression. External shocks could compress it dramatically. A major war, a pandemic, a financial crisis, or a BRICS currency launch could trigger Stage 5 within months rather than years. The Mexican peso took 6 months from stable to collapsed. The Russian ruble took 3 months. The dollar benefits from reserve status and internal debt, which slows the process. But once confidence breaks, even reserve currencies can fall rapidly. Why this time is different is always wrong. Every empire in the debt trap believed it was exceptional. Spain controlled the world's silver and thought wealth was infinite. France was the grand monarchy that had ruled for 8 centuries and thought royal authority was unquestionable. Japan was the economic miracle that would overtake America and thought growth was permanent. America has the reserve currency and thinks the rules don't apply. The trap doesn't care about exceptionalism. It cares about arithmetic. When debt grows faster than the capacity to service it, mathematics takes over. No amount of military power, cultural prestige, or historical legacy changes compound interest. Spain had more silver than any nation in history. It declared bankruptcy 9 times. Thanks for watching. France had Versailles and the most powerful monarchy in Europe. It ended with the king's head in a basket. Japan had the economic miracle of the 1,980 seconds. It lost 3 decades and counting. America has the reserve currency and the strongest military in history. History suggests this provides time, not immunity. The sequence is identical across 469 years. The only variable is speed. 4 debt traps. 4 centuries. 4 empires that believed they were too powerful to fail. 1557. Spain declares bankruptcy despite controlling the world's silver. 1789. France erupts in revolution because the monarchy bankrupted the nation. 1990. Japan enters economic stagnation that continues 36 years later. 2026. America reaches $38.5 trillion in debt, 4 years ahead of projections. The intervals between traps are compressing. Spain to France, 232 years. France to Japan, 201 years. Japan to America, 36 years. The mechanism is accelerating, but the destination remains unchanged. Every sovereign debt trap in history has ended in one of 4 ways: serial default, revolution, stagnation, or currency replacement. No nation has ever escaped the trap through growth alone once stage 3 is reached. The mathematics become irreversible. What history teaches. Lesson 1. Resources don't save you. Spain discovered that infinite silver cannot solve a debt trap if spending exceeds any possible revenue. The treasure fleets crossed the Atlantic carrying millions in precious metal, and all of it flowed directly to Genoese creditors. Spain was a conduit, not a beneficiary. America's lesson is identical. Having the reserve currency creates the illusion of infinite resources. We can just print dollars. But printing creates inflation, which erodes credibility, which accelerates de-dollarization, which removes the reserve currency privilege. The resource that seems infinite becomes finite the moment you abuse it. Lesson 2. Debt plus inequality equals revolution. France's debt trap became the French Revolution because the burden fell entirely on the poor while the wealthy remained exempt. When the population realized the monarchy had bankrupted the nation for personal extravagance, legitimacy evaporated. 4 years later, the king was dead. America in 2026 has similar dynamics. The top 1% controls 32% of wealth. Inflation erodes working-class purchasing power while inflating asset prices benefits the wealthy. Student debt cannot be discharged, but corporate debt is refinanced. Bank failures trigger bailouts, but homeowner foreclosures do not. The perception that the system is rigged is mathematically accurate. France's revolution started as a fiscal crisis and became a social explosion. America's polarization and inequality suggest the same ingredients are present. Lesson 3. You can avoid collapse by accepting stagnation. Japan proved that sovereign debt traps don't require dramatic collapse. You can prevent revolution. You can maintain social order. You can avoid default. The cost is accepting that an entire generation will live their adult lives in an economy that doesn't grow. 36 years. That's longer than most careers. It means Japanese workers who graduated in 1990 are now approaching retirement, and they experienced zero real growth across their entire working lives. Stability without prosperity. Order without opportunity. Survival without thriving. This may be America's future, not catastrophic collapse, but slow exhaustion. Lost decades where promises made to one generation cannot be kept for the next. Where retirement at 65 becomes retirement at 75. Where home ownership becomes perpetual renting. Where your children will be wealthier than you becomes your children will struggle more than you did. It's not dramatic, but it's tragedy nonetheless. Lesson 4. The fourth path has no historical precedent. Spain, France, and Japan all faced debt traps, but none held global reserve currency status. America is the first nation to face a sovereign debt trap while simultaneously providing the currency the world uses for trade and reserves. This creates a unique danger. If America loses reserve currency status, all the mechanisms that slowed the trap foreign demand for treasuries, ability to borrow and own currency, network effects from dollar dominance disappear simultaneously. The slow-motion crisis could become rapid collapse. The dollar reserve share, declining from 71% to 58%, is the early warning. If it falls below 50%, the network effect reverses. Suddenly, everyone abandons dollars because everyone else is abandoning them. Treasury auctions fail, interest rates spike, and the crisis Americans thought would unfold over decades happens in months. What is a build? In 107, what is now need is a build Oliver. What is a build it is a build, with most acts to the waiter. The 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, the slow burn, most likely, 60%. America follows a combination of the Spanish and Japanese models. Sustained inflation of 4 to 6% for 10 to 15 years erodes debt in real terms, Spanish-style serial soft defaults. Simultaneously, GDP growth stagnates at 1 to 2% annually, Japanese-style lost decades. There are some of the rated actually 1 of cent are 2 actually do. The dollar gradually loses reserve status, declining from 58% to 35% of global reserves over 10 years. Standard of living declines 30 to 40% in real terms for the median household. The wealthy, who own assets that inflate, maintain, or increase wealth. The working and middle classes fall behind permanently. By 2040, America remains powerful but no longer exceptional. A normal, developed nation with normal constraints. The American dream becomes historical memory rather than present reality. This is not collapse. It's managed decline. Painful but survivable. Scenario 2. The crisis reset possible, 25%. A triggering event, major war, pandemic, financial collapse, BRICS currency launch forces emergency action. Debt crisis combines with social inequality to create political explosion reminiscent of France 1789. Hit as these remand. We kinda stands Idas age. We have a goaded share. Government responds with emergency measures. Mandatory central bank digital currency, wealth taxes, capital controls, forced treasury purchases by pension funds. The Constitution is tested or amended. Federal-state tensions intensify. Political legitimacy is questioned. The debt is addressed through partial repudiation disguised as reform. Old obligations are converted to new dollars at disadvantageous rates. Savings lose 50 to 70% of value. Social Security and Medicare are restructured. Reformed is the euphemism used. Timeline, 2027 to 2030. The crisis compresses what would have taken a decade into 18 months of chaos, followed by new system. Scenario 3. The catastrophic collapse. Unlikely but possible, 15%. Multiple low-probability events converge. War with China over Taiwan. BRICS currency launches with immediate adoption by oil exporters. Treasury auction fails. Dollar reserve status collapses below 40% in months. Interest rates spike to 8 to 10% as markets demand risk premium on U.S. debt. Federal government cannot refinance maturing bonds at these rates. Partial default becomes necessary. Dollar loses 50% of value against other currencies within a year. Inflation exceeds 10% technical hyperinflation threshold. Supply chains break, imports become unaffordable. Social order strains. Federal institutions lose legitimacy. Regional fragmentation becomes possible. This scenario is least likely precisely because it's most catastrophic. Every powerful institution, political, financial, military, will work desperately to prevent it. But low probability is not zero probability. The survival playbook. For individuals, preserve purchasing power, hold 20 to 30% of assets in hard stores of value gold, silver, productive land. These survived all previous debt traps. That after Acher, the president's a president, not a candidated, in with his validities after forno. Diversify currency exposure. Hold assets in multiple currencies and jurisdictions. Don't concentrate wealth in a single system that may restructure. Develop real skills. Technical abilities that generate value regardless of monetary system, engineering, medicine, agriculture, construction, remain valuable through transitions. Build community networks. Local relationships become economic assets when distant systems break down. The Romans, who survived the 3rd century crisis, had strong local ties. The Soviets, who survived the 1991 collapse, had tight family networks. Reduce debt. In inflationary periods, debtors benefit and savers suffer. But in crisis periods, debt becomes trap if income collapses. The optimal position is assets without leverage. For nations non-U.S. Reduce dollar exposure. Diversify reserves. Develop bilateral trade agreements in local currencies. Build alternatives to dollar-based systems. Strengthen domestic fundamentals. Low debt. Productive economy. Social cohesion. These provide resilience when global systems restructure. Prepare for transition. The decline of American power creates opportunities for others. Position strategically for the post-dollar world. For policy, necessary but unlikely. Immediate freeze on new deficit spending. Structural reform of entitlements raising retirement ages, means testing benefits. Tax increases on high earners sufficient to stabilize debt to GDP ratio. Growth policies deregulation, infrastructure investment, education reform to expand GDP faster than debt. All of this is economically sound and politically impossible until crisis forces it. The tragedy is that action taken now would be relatively painless. Action taken in 5 years will be agonizing. Action taken in 10 years may be too late. The final warning. Imperial Spain did not fall in a single day. It took 109 years and 9 bankruptcies, but each bankruptcy weakened it further. Each restructuring reduced its capacity. And eventually, the empire that controlled a quarter of the globe became a second-tier European state. The French Monarchy did not fall in a single day. It took 74 years of accumulating debt from Louis XIV to Louis XVI, but when the breaking point came in 1789, it came fast. Within 4 years, the 1,000-year monarchy was abolished and the king was executed. Japan's economy did not collapse in a single day. It has been 36 years since the bubble burst in 1990, but an entire generation has lived their careers in stagnation. The collapse was avoided, the recovery never came, and 3 decades later, Japan is still trapped. America will not collapse in a single day. The debt trap that destroyed Spain, France, and Japan is now closing on the United States. But reserve currency status provides time, years, perhaps a decade, enough time to make different choices. History shows that no nation makes those choices until forced. Every empire believes its trap is different, its power is greater, its circumstances are unique, its currency is special. And every empire discovers too late that the mathematics of compound interest don't care about exceptionalism. On November 29th, 1557, King Philip II of Spain declared bankruptcy despite controlling more silver than any nation in history. On July 14th, 1789, French revolutionaries stormed the Bastille because the monarchy bankrupted the nation. On December 29th, 1989, Japan's Nikkei peaked at 38,916 before beginning a decline that continues 36 years later. On January 10th, 2026, the United States national debt stands at $38. $5 trillion, $1 trillion for every day of the year, $2 billion for every minute, growing faster than projections and faster than the economy that must service it. 4 debt traps across 469 years. 4 empires that thought they were exceptional. 4 mathematical sequences that proved them wrong. The pattern is clear. The mathematics are locked in. And history has shown that no empire, no matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, no matter how dominant, escapes the sovereign debt trap once the compound interest spiral begins. Spain controlled the world's silver. It declared bankruptcy 9 times. France built Versailles. It ended in revolution. Japan was the economic miracle. It lost 3 decades and counting. America has the reserve currency. History suggests this provides delay, not immunity. The sequence has never changed. The only variable is time. Spain, France, Japan. America is next.